And now let's move to our conclusions. Mr. Timer, this segment will also be 10 minutes. Let's have a green light at 8 minutes, a yellow light at 9.
Were we having a 5-minute break before that or before the Q&A?
It's going to come after this one right here, no problem. Mr. Timer, did you get those instructions? Okay, Dr. David Wood, you'll come on up with your 10-minute conclusion, and then we'll have Hina Databoy. Hey, you're here.
Let's talk about Scooby-Doo for a second. If you remember the old Scooby-Doo show, some of you are too young, but on Scooby-Doo, you know, every week there were, you know, a new monster, a vampire, a mummy, something else. And by the end of the episode, the mask gets pulled off, and it's a carnival worker or some businessman is trying to scare everyone off, and so on. And so there were always natural explanations for what was going on. And then all of a sudden, there's Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, where it turned out to be real zombies. Don't know if you saw it, but there were actual zombies in this episode. But Fred, the skeptic, just keeps trying to deny that there are zombies. He keeps saying it's a projector, it's just a projector, it's just a projector. And then, you know, he makes physical contact with one. And then it's, you just pull off the mask, pull off the mask. And he tries so hard to pull off this zombie's mask that he ends up pulling the zombie's head off. And the zombie is still living. And the zombie picks its head back up and puts it back on. So Fred says, it's animatronics. So now it's, you know, it's someone actually, they're machines. And pretty soon there's zombies coming from every direction. And Daphne says, Fred, are you saying this is all animatronics? She says, you're not a skeptic, you're in denial. And, you know, this is just a cartoon. There's not taking zombies seriously here, but the point is interesting. Fred, you're saying that you're a skeptic here. You're claiming that you're a skeptic. If you're really a skeptic, you shouldn't just be skeptical of supernatural explanations. You should also be skeptical about natural explanations when they really just don't account for what you're trying to account for. And I think that is a valid principle. Anyone can apply their skepticism to something they don't want to believe in and become so skeptical that they don't believe in it. And you know, you can do this. You could sit down right now and make a list. Here are things I want to believe in, and here are other things I don't want to believe in. For the things I don't want to believe in, I'm going to be so incredibly skeptical that no amount of evidence could ever convince me. And for the things that I want to believe in, I will lower my level of skepticism to the floor so that anything qualifies as clear proof that this thing I want to believe in is true. Anyone can do this. Anyone can do this, theists, atheists, whatever. But once we're aware of it, we should try to control it and make sure we're applying a consistent standard. Now, let me go through just a few things here because they kind of sum up a lot of what's been going on. On the one, I've never understood the point of Hina keeps saying that I said no theist has ever. I didn't say that from the very first time I said it. I said yes, you can find theists down through history who have attributed everything that happens to God. I'm saying that's a different sort of thing than what was brought in where you needed God as an explanation for something. We need God as an explanation. That generally was for things like the origin of the universe, or why certain things are right or wrong, or how living things formed, and so on. And so those are still the things that we appeal to. Yes, you can find theists who believe all kinds of things. You can find theists who believe pretty much anything you want to believe down through the ages. We're talking about the general thrust here. And what would it mean? When a scientist believes that he has an explanation, that explanation turns out to be wrong, and later on he comes up with another explanation, does that say, you know, his old explanations are getting pushed out, science is just nonsense now? No, you don't say that. You say, oh, so-and-so was wrong about this, and now he's getting, you know, he's got an argument. In other words, you can't say, this view failed at this point, therefore you can never appeal to that regardless. Again, I mean, you can go to the opening chapters of Genesis or anywhere. What are they talking about? They're talking about the origin of the world, life, things like that. Efficiency. Well, this is interesting. Hina argues that the design isn't efficient. And she says, how do we know that something would be better? Because life is good. Life is a good thing. That's exactly my point. That is a moral statement. Now, I'm not saying you don't know this. I'm saying you do know this, but it makes no sense on an atheistic worldview. You have a view according to which we're molecules in motion. We develop by certain processes, and what really governs the process is survival and reproduction. We're all going to die, and why is that bad? Everything that lives is going to die. Why would you say that that's bad, that life is better, that life is good? There's no basis for saying it on your worldview, and yet you would say it. And so we have to ask where that's coming from. And to tie in with this, Hina says that morality is not objective. This is very interesting. She says that certain things just make for a better society. A couple of things here. One, there goes any of the arguments about bad design. Notice all of the arguments on bad design presuppose a kind of moral aspect. The reason you don't complain about this laptop doing not nearly as much as it could if it were designed better, you never use that because no one's suffering as a result of this laptop not being much better or something. So you only really say this is poorly designed if it's leading to some kind of suffering. But if morality is not objective, then how do you say that anything would have to do that? In other words, we have here just a perfect example of this sort of tension, and you find this tension all over the place. Dawkins said it, for instance. So on one page, Dawkins will say that the universe just is bottom, there's no meaning, and there's no right and wrong. It's just we're machines for propagating DNA, and then we'll go on to condemn all these sorts of things that are wrong about the world, right? And you don't notice the tension, right? And so it seems on one level you notice, hey, certain things are wrong in an objective sense, or right in an objective sense, and then turn right around when you're challenged. What's the source of that? Oh, I'm not saying there's anything that's objective about this. Well, then you have to drop the argument. You can't appeal to values that God would be required to follow if they're not objective. Hina gave a good example. Well, what I had mentioned that about karate. Karate, yes, you can learn things over time, but that's completely consistent with your structures and abilities having been sort of selected by natural selection over time. You have all those abilities. Yes, you can learn all kinds of things, but the things you learn have to be consistent with the sort of thing you are. You can take a bowl of oatmeal and try to make that laptop out of it. It's not going to work. Right? It's not the sort of thing that can become a laptop. You need something with the ability to become a laptop in order to even make it into a laptop. Similarly, you can learn karate. You can learn karate given the abilities that you are selected for. What you can't do is if you have processes, if your cognitive faculties were selected because they helped you find food and helped you find a mate, you can't then say, and they're reliable for telling me about the origin of the universe or the meaning of life or moral values and so on. It just doesn't apply. And yet, again, our atheist friends are kind of having it both ways. Here's how we developed, but we're going to argue like that's not how we developed at all. And, you kind of have to pick one. Hina says, where's the thought that's not physical? But then she went on to say, yes, those molecules do not have a truth value. That's precisely the point. If the molecules do not have a truth value, but your belief has a truth value, there's a problem there. You can't, and it seemed where she was going with this is, this is just my interpretation of this brain state. No, some of my beliefs are actually true and actually false. If they correspond to reality, they are true. If they don't correspond to reality, they are false. But it makes no sense to say, here, let's map out this brain state and map out this other brain state. They're both just these patterns of molecules. This one's true and this one's false. It's not, in other words, it's not the sort of, it makes perfect sense to apply to one and not to the other. The point here is, if two things are identical, if they're the exact same thing, then they have the same properties. They can be described in the same way. Water, H2O, two different terms, but they have the exact same properties. That's how you know they're the same thing. if you're talking about mental states and physical states in your brain, they don't have the same properties and can't be described in the same way, and they can't therefore be identical. If they're not identical, then your mental states can't be completely described in terms of the physical, and they require something else. In naturalism, there is nothing else. You've got nothing else. You've got particles in motion. That's what you have. You have particles in motion. You have natural laws. You have time and space. If mental states cannot be described in those terms, then you need more in your worldview. I have something more in my worldview. And finally, I think Hina's misunderstood when I'm talking about reproduction. She's saying I say reproduction drives everything we do. That's not the point of that at all. The point of the reproduction is everything that you are now was because of the way your ancestors were in terms of your physical structures. And so if that's the case, according to naturalism, then you can't then say you have these abilities, physical abilities, that your ancestors didn't have. And Hina concluded by saying she'd rather be on the right side, but what is right on her worldview?
I guess I should have worn an ascot today to embody this Fred that apparently I am from Scooby-Doo. I will be the first to say that I don't necessarily claim to be a skeptic. And I did want to believe in God, believe it or not. I'm standing here today arguing against the existence of God. It's not because I wanted to be here. As my intro stated, I would have never believed I would have ended up being here. I did want to believe in God. I looked for evidence. I sought it out, and I could not find it. So I'm not sitting here doggedly persisting in some belief because I really want to believe it. I spent years searching. I spent years sitting there and trying to figure out what made sense. So I do take a little bit of exception to the claim that I am doggedly anti-deity. Efficiency is the least use of resources to achieve the most result. There's no inherent morality to it. There's no inherent good or bad behind it. I may have misspoken when I used the word good. I didn't even necessarily say that death was bad. And in fact, I don't think a theist has a leg to stand on when they say death is bad, because their deity created death. Their deity designed a world, allegedly optimally or non-optimally, I'm not sure, where death is part of the way that we exist. As far as science goes versus theism, science has a built-in self-correction mechanism called the scientific method, where you take a hypothesis, you test the claims, you figure out your conclusions, you change your conclusions based on the evidence, and so on and so forth. Theism, on the other hand, has built its entire history on saying we are right, we will always be right, and we will never change, despite the fact that we see changes as we speak. We see religions, well, let's say theism, to be more precise. Theists have changed their arguments over time, despite the fact that they claim that it never changes and it's always correct. Science never claims to be dogmatically and completely true forever and ever. That has never been the central claim of science. The central claim of science is that we need to find more evidence. We need to prove ourselves wrong. Scientists love this. This is what they live on. As far as laptop design goes, I'm not really sure if that's relevant, because I don't think that we think that the person who made the laptop was omniscient, with all due respect to the dead Steve Jobs. We don't claim that this laptop has to be as optimal and efficient as possible, because we don't think that the person who made it, or the very many, many people behind it, are omniscient. But if you're going to claim that this universe is built by something omniscient, you're going to have to show that there's actually signs of omniscience behind it. And the flaws in the design clearly show that that's not the case. And honestly, if we're going to say that atheists have no basis to say anything's right or wrong, isn't all the right or wrong here created by the same creator that theists claim is behind the universe? So what basis do they have to say the same thing? We can actually have arguments about things that are not objective. We do not have to say, oh, because I don't think that there is an objective morality, which, by the way, reality sort of shows that there is no objective morality. People are constantly arguing about what's moral and what's not. If there were an objective morality, we would see it somewhere. But even within the same religions, the same societies, the same political parties, heck, the same households, you don't see objectivity in morality. It simply is not there. I would like to see where it would be, because I don't see it. But yet we still have conversations about it. And so we can have conversations about things that are not objective. Things like laptops. Maybe I think that an Apple is a waste of money, and maybe someone else thinks that it's not. And we can still have a conversation about it, even though it's subjective. As far as natural selection goes, again, we're going back to this fallacy of seeing patterns where there aren't patterns. We're not necessarily selected for karate. Karate is something we've developed because of the bodies that we have. And that can go for almost anything in human civilization. It's not so much that, an atheist thinks that we were selected for karate. That's completely ridiculous. Instead, it's that we have developed various forms of martial arts and physical exertion in accordance with our physical abilities. We have developed them. There was no need for an external force to tell us what to do that way. As far as the thought problem goes, your thought corresponds to your perception of reality. So where you would see a grilled cheese, maybe one of my ancestors hundreds of years ago would have seen some weird squishy looking thing in the shape of a square. So our perceptions affect what we see as reality. I'm not dealing in truth values here. I'm just talking about what happens in the brain. Interpretation is also a physical mechanism. So it's not that there's some mysterious thing that takes this brain knowledge and makes it into our perception. We have brains for this very reason. We have nervous systems. We have our gut, our digestive system, which also contains a significant concentration of neural tissues. And that's how we interpret the information we are given. And that's where the differences in interpretation come in. What is right? That's a pretty big question, and I don't think that was the topic of our debate either. It's a very large, very sweeping question. But I can tell you that when I did a debate 2 or 3 years ago on this very same topic, I could take the theists that I debated, who made very similar arguments to David, and put them together in a room and say, what is right? Go. And they would probably spend a long time and never actually come to any agreement, because this other guy was not as nice as David, I'll tell you that. He had completely different arguments, and he lied to me and deceived me, which I think David would find to be morally reprehensible. Even though I think that the creator that David attributes to this universe created liars and reprehensible people as well. So I'm not sure where you can say it's bad or good, since this omniscient deity created it. The bottom line is that, again, when I say I want to be right, what I mean is as close to the best conclusions we're ever going to get to ever. That may sound wishy-washy, that may sound questionable, that may sound confusing. But I think that it's better to accept the fact that there is uncertainty in the universe than to have false certainty. There are a lot of things you don't understand. There are a lot of things that I don't understand. There are a lot of things that our ancestors didn't understand. There are things that human beings will probably kill each other and die out over before we understand them. But that doesn't mean that we have to settle for these explanations that shrink and shrink to even smaller places over time. We can do better. And promoting the idea that there must be some sort of supernatural explanation, in fact, hinders our ability to get closer to understanding more and more. And that is the sad irony of theists using arguments like this, because the intellectual predecessors for these arguments would have hindered the progress of this exact line of thought.